Behind the heroism and victories of World War II, darker tales of brutality lie hidden. As we reflect on this monumental conflict, it's crucial to remember that the narrative of any war is complex, woven with both valor and vice. The Soviet Union, an undeniable giant in the Allied victory, also has chapters in its history book that are less spoken of, marked by severe violations of war ethics and humanity. During the years of World War II, the Soviet forces, driven by desperate circumstances and stern ideology, committed acts that would later be scrutinized as war crimes. These incidents ranged from mass executions and deportations to the mistreatment of prisoners and civilians alike. While the Red Army marched towards Berlin, many in the shadowed fringes of Eastern Europe and beyond faced the grim realities of war, imprinted by Soviet actions. Acknowledging these aspects of history is not about diminishing the sacrifices made, but about presenting a fuller, unvarnished picture of the past. It's about understanding that in the fog of war, morality can sometimes be the first casualty. Join us as we unveil the top 10 war crimes of the USSR, shedding light on the shadows of war. Our first grim tale takes us to the Katyn Forest, a name synonymous with betrayal and bloodshed. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, carried out a calculated and cold-blooded execution of over 22,000 Polish military officers, policemen, and intellectuals. This mass execution took place not only in the secluded depths of the Katyn Forest, but also in several other locations, such as Tver and Kharkiv. The victims, captured during the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939, were bound and shot in the back of the head. Their bodies were then buried in mass graves, obscured from the world until the truth emerged. This act was a violation of the Geneva Conventions, which sought to protect prisoners of war and civilians during conflicts. The Soviet Union's denial and subsequent blame on the Nazis added layers of political intrigue and deceit, significantly straining Polish-Soviet relations even after the war. The Katyn Massacre remains one of the most chilling examples of premeditated extermination during the war. And not through bullets alone, but through banishment did the USSR reshape occupied lands. The Soviet regime, under the guise of security and territorial integration, orchestrated one of the most extensive forced migration campaigns in modern history. From the Baltic states to eastern Poland, and even parts of Romania, hundreds of thousands were ripped from their homes and sent to distant, often inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union. Men, women, and children were loaded onto freight trains with little regard for their health or well-being and deported en masse. These journeys were marred by harsh conditions, severe overcrowding, and a lack of basic necessities such as food and water. Many perished before even reaching their unknown destinations. The strategic motives behind these mass deportations were twofold: to suppress potential resistance in newly acquired territories and to repopulate strategic areas within the Soviet borders with more politically reliable elements. This brutal reshaping of populations not only sought to secure the Soviet grip on occupied territories, but also aimed to integrate them into the Soviet ideological framework. The scars of these mass deportations are etched deep into the memory of nations, forever altering their demographic landscapes. In war, the line between survival and cruelty can blur, as seen in NKVD Order No. 270. Issued in August 1941, this order was a grim testament to the Soviet Union's wartime discipline. It mandated harsh penalties for soldiers who were captured by the enemy and managed to escape back to Soviet lines. Upon their return, these soldiers often faced execution or imprisonment, accused of cowardice or treason, mostly without the benefit of a fair trial. This order not only punished the soldiers who had endured enemy captivity, but also sent a chilling message to all troops about the consequences of surrender. This draconian order exemplifies the harsh measures taken against their own, under the guise of maintaining discipline. Even resistance against tyranny can turn tyrannical. Soviet partisans, operating behind enemy lines, are often heralded for their resistance against German occupation during World War II. However, their campaign was not without severe consequences for the civilian population. In their zeal to combat the enemy, these partisans sometimes engaged in actions that blurred the moral lines of warfare. Reports detail how they committed atrocities, including the indiscriminate killing of civilians, acts of terror, and other brutalities that inflicted suffering not only on their enemies, but also on those they purported to protect. the line between freedom fighter and oppressor was, at times, tragically thin. For many prisoners of war, survival was a daily battle against not just their captors, but the very conditions of their captivity. During World War II, the Soviet Union's handling of German and Axis prisoners of war was notoriously severe. These POWs were often thrust into a grim world of forced labor, where they toiled under grueling conditions in mines, forests, and construction projects across the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. The deprivation extended beyond physical labor. Basic human necessities such as adequate food, shelter, and medical care were starkly lacking. Reports from the time describe overcrowded, unheated barracks where disease ran rampant and the death toll climbed steadily. Winter brought its own horror, with frostbite and hypothermia common among the inadequately clothed prisoners. This harsh treatment was not merely a byproduct of war's cruelty, but a systematic approach that saw these men not as humans, but as resources to be expended. The plight of these prisoners highlights the brutal reality of war, where humanity often succumbs to cruelty. As the Red Army advanced, a trail of looting and destruction followed. Throughout Eastern Europe, Soviet forces were not merely liberators from Nazi oppression, they also became agents of chaos and devastation. Towns and cities were stripped of their valuables, from priceless cultural artifacts to everyday necessities. Homes, businesses, and even religious sites were not spared, as soldiers took what they could carry and destroyed what they could not. This widespread pillaging did more than just rob people of their possessions, it assaulted the very soul of these communities, leaving scars that would long outlast the war itself. The devastation wrought was not just physical, but cultural, stripping regions of their heritage and wealth. A heinous war crime, often overshadowed by the fog of war, is the widespread assault against women. As Soviet forces advanced through Eastern Europe during World War II, numerous reports emerged of sexual violence perpetrated by soldiers against women and girls in the occupied territories. These brutal acts were not isolated incidents, but occurred frequently enough to reflect a disturbing pattern of behavior that went largely unchecked by military authorities. The impact on the victims was profound and devastating. Women of all ages suffered not only physical harm, but deep psychological scars. Families were torn apart, and communities were left in fear and mistrust. The trauma of these violations has echoed through generations, contributing to lasting social and psychological repercussions. In the aftermath of the war, these atrocities were largely swept under the rug, with little recognition or justice for the victims. It took decades for these crimes to be openly discussed and acknowledged, reflecting a broader struggle to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. These acts of violence left lasting wounds on societies, wounds that took decades to even begin to acknowledge. Under the guise of military necessity, a city was brought to its knees, starving its own people. The Siege of Leningrad, a grim chapter in the annals of World War II, began in September 1941 and lasted a harrowing 872 days. The German army encircled the city, cutting off all supply routes to Leningrad. But the siege also highlighted severe mismanagement and ruthless decisions by the Soviet authorities themselves. As winter set in, temperatures plummeted, and food supplies dwindled to near nothingness. Soviet leaders, prioritizing military needs over civilian survival, implemented food rationing that was woefully inadequate. The daily ration at one point was reduced to a mere 125 grams of bread, often mixed with sawdust and other inedible substances. The citizens of Leningrad endured unimaginable hardships. Reports of starvation became widespread. People were forced to survive on whatever they could find, leading to instances of cannibalism. Despite these severe conditions, the spirit of the city's defenders never wavered, and they continued to resist the siege at great personal cost. The blockade not only resulted in the deaths of up to 1 million civilians, but also left deep psychological scars on the survivors. The Soviet government, under Joseph Stalin, maintained a tight grip on the narrative, often downplaying the extent of the tragedy and the role of their own policies in exacerbating the suffering. The siege remains a stark reminder of how war can consume even the innocent. As we reflect on these dark chapters of history, we confront the complexities of human nature and the horrors of war. From the chilling execution of thousands in the Katyn forest to the grim conditions imposed on prisoners of war, each account sheds light on the severe breaches of humanity committed during World War II. The mass deportations, the systemic atrocities by Soviet partisans, and the severe repercussions faced by those who merely sought survival paint a grim picture of a time where law and order were overshadowed by cruelty and desperation. The destruction and looting of occupied territories, along with the forced repatriation of millions, remind us of the profound impacts of war, not just on the present but on the fabric of future generations. The acts of war rape and the ruthless siege that led to the starvation of countless innocents in Leningrad reveal the depth of suffering inflicted in times of conflict. These narratives are not just historical accounts, they are stark reminders of the price paid by ordinary people caught in the crossfire of ideologies and power struggles. By acknowledging the past, we hope to foster a future where such atrocities can be prevented. Thank you for joining us in this important reflection.